I don't know whether you know this or not, but the song, My Tribute, that we just sang was written in 1971. And what I'm going to do first before we get, I'm really going to be talking about Galatians in some of these examples I'm given, because the interesting thing about Galatians is that we are in the same situation today that the Galatians were in. Different people, different personalities, different things, but it's the same situation. And you'll see in a minute how Paul was struggling with the same thing that we struggle with, and that is that people tend to follow people. And while we understand the importance of leadership and so forth, the fact remains that the person that we need to be following is Jesus Christ. Now I want to give you an example of that with the song of My Tribute. So My Tribute came out in 1971. I think it was written by Andre Crouch. It was recorded by him, and he's very popular back then. I was in youth ministry at the time, and we were taking 100, 150 young people to Falls Creek Baptist Assembly in Oklahoma. It's down close to Davis, Oklahoma, if you're familiar with that area down in the south, close to the Texas border. Incredibly big camp. I've mentioned this to you before. It's like a city. Somewhere around 4,000 to 5,000 youth would come each week for about 4 or 5 weeks, and they come from all over the place, mostly Oklahoma, but all over. Whoever could get a cabin. They had cabins that you rented. Some of the churches owned their own cabins. They'd go 1 week and rent their cabin to other churches and so forth. So anyway, we had a great big outdoor worship tabernacle. They now have an air-conditioned one. I'm sort of upset about that, the fact that they waited all this time. But the truth of the matter is, the outside tabernacle sort of setting was part of the whole ambiance, and the essence of it. And it was hot, but it seemed like nobody cared. And we always had speakers come in that were really good speakers for youth groups and so forth. But one of the big things was music. And believe it or not, most of the songs we sang were hymns. This is the youth of the 70s. There was more teenagers in the 70s than any other time in the 20th century. And that's why youth ministry kind of sprung up, and I was sort of part of that pioneering of youth ministry, at least in Oklahoma. And so we would take these kids to the camp, and each night we would sing all these hymns, and then at the end of each service we would sing My Tribute, and there was someone who would sing that, who would lead us in that, not the regular music guy, but a music person from one of the churches. And I am trying so hard to remember this gentleman's name. I'm sure he's still around somewhere. I'd have to run him down to see where he is, but he's in Oklahoma somewhere. He might be retired, I don't know by now. But anyway, he had an incredible voice. And, and he could sing this particular song beyond what you can even imagine. And so by about the third night, it was just the ramping up the youth, and that was fine. I mean, in the words of the song, "To who give the glory? God," right? Monty, that was his name, Monty. His last name wasn't Python; it was Monty. And but I can't think of his last name. But anyway, Monty would sing this song, and he was so good. After about the third night, the youth would come up after the service and ask for his autograph. And, they would just swarm him after the service. So by the time we got to the end of the week, and he was doing this all 4 or 5 weeks, he actually not resigned, but he refused to continue to sing it. And the reason was because he felt like the focus had gotten on him instead of on Christ. And this is very common, and even today. And and our model for the 20th century really got us into trouble in this regard. Now, I don't know how many of you have even heard of the Jesus Music movie. Jennifer and I were going to try to go this weekend. We didn't get a chance to go, but we want to go see that. The Jesus Music movie is a documentary about how the Jesus Music, which My Tribute was a part of in 1971. My Tribute was, it wasn't even in the Baptist hymnal. It's in the Baptist hymnal now. But it wasn't then. It was part of a movement that countered the free love movement. The free love movement, you know, and the make love not war and the whole Vietnam thing and all those kinds of things. Larry Norman, who was actually the father of contemporary Christian music, he's gone now. He's with the Lord. But he was doing this Jesus music. It was sort of in the underground because the church was totally rejecting it. And songs like My Tribute, which were a little more softer versions of some of the other Jesus music that was going on, managed to kind of creep in and become popular. But a lot of the music that was going on by Larry Norman and others, you didn't really even know too much about. But music was beginning to change. So you have to ask the question, why was that happening? Well, there was two reasons. One was, I already mentioned, the counterculture that was coming up from the Make Love Not War group, the protest, the Jane Fondas, and all of those folks. And so this Jesus music was actually a reaction to that, saying that Jesus is love. Jesus is the one we need to focus on. And then the second piece of that was the church. The church was except for really the youth would go to camp. And they'd get so excited, they'd be fired up, and they'd come back to church. It's like, you know, it would just be a downer. Of course, the church liked seeing the youth excited, but they didn't want that excitement to carry over into them. You know, it's fine for youth, but not for us. We, you know, have to stay in control. And yes. But anyway, it was fascinating how this music, this Jesus music, was trying to get the focus back onto Jesus. That was the purpose of it. That was the hope. That was what they were trying to do. They were trying to say, the kind of love that you guys are talking about is not the love we're talking about. We're talking about Jesus' love. And then in the church, they were saying, hey, you guys got to get the focus back on Jesus. You got to focus on everything else. Pastors, music, hymns, how the pews, had to have pews, all those things, the way we dressed. And so this was a reaction to that. And so there was this tension, of course, that was created. And there was actual groups that got kicked out of churches. There was a young evangelist who came to a church that I was attending. He had a group, 3 guys, 2 guitars, and 3 singers. I think they were called Dove, and I think that's what they call themselves. And they did what we would consider today to be very light contemporary music. It was not heavy whatsoever. And they would do a little concert after the revival service. And after a couple of concerts, the church said, well, we really don't want that, so you can move on. He didn't even get to finish his revival. They just didn't want that. And so they just kind of went on down the road. So this whole thing of Jesus music, and what you heard even this morning from our worship team is a result of that early Jesus music movement. Like it or love it, hate it or whatever, that's how all of that contemporary music came about. And over the years, there's been all kinds of rap music, there's been punk music. There was a punk rock church in California, and it actually had about 5,000 young people in it. And the way you could know that you were near that church is the ground was actually shaking. because it was so loud and that kind of music, and then if you've ever noticed, if you've ever driven up next to somebody who has their windows down and the rap music and the punk music, whatever that loud music is, it just, shakes you. That was what was going on. And this church was huge, and that's all they did was punk rock Jesus music. It was sort of like a God rules, God rules. I mean, that was their thing, and it was an attempt to get Jesus back into the focus and back into the center. Now, as with all things, especially when human beings are involved, what happens is we tend to go to extremes, right? So we kind of go way over here, and we're kind of in left field, or we're kind of way over here. We have a real difficult time finding the middle. This is why church merging is so difficult. Because what happens is in a church merge, many times the church tends to go toward the strongest culture, what the strongest culture is. So one of the things we're trying to do, and we haven't accomplished it yet, but one of the things we're trying to do is to bring two cultures together and actually blend them the way they should be with the focus on Jesus. Very difficult to do because on one hand, we have a white culture that grew up with certain kinds of music. We have a black culture that grew up with certain kind of music, certain kind of worship, and so forth. But this is the problem that we're struggling with today in the church, even among just white churches or just black churches or whatever you want, however you want to define it. And it is a struggle that started way back when Christianity began and came out of the Jewish community. And we see those two cultures clashing and having the same kind of issue that we have today. And then we had in the early 70s with the Jesus music and the counterculture and the church appearing to be kind of dead to a lot of young people and so forth. And now today, and there's a number of other variables and factors, but nevertheless, we have the same issues, and we're still fighting the same battles, and we're still have the tendency to find somebody that we can sort of put on a pedestal, and we can say, okay, we're following him because he's a great preacher, or he's a great singer, or whatever, and we're comfortable there, and so forth. This is what, to a large degree, created the megachurches. Now, megachurches do a lot of good. I mean, I've talked about this before. I don't want to belabor it, but I mean, they have mission things going on. They have tons of money. They have lots of equipment. They can stream. They can do so many things. And God uses all those things. God uses what he's able to use. As pathetic as sometimes we are, he uses what he can. We have a free will, and we mess it up a lot. And so he uses what he can. So this is not to disparage anyone or any church or anything. I'm just trying to point out the problem that we face. The problem that we face. And that is, we tend to follow a person like Monty who sings great, and we want his autograph. And that happened in the Jesus music movement as well, as groups came up, and became popular just like rock and roll groups. They wanted autographs and all kinds of things. And it became frustrating even to some of the groups that toured. We had a couple of groups that came in over to our smaller venue when I was at As You Are Church. We had about 300 seat. We could get 300 in there. We had to cram them in there, but we got them in there. And groups like Super Chick and 7 Day Slumber and some of those, they got to the point where they were tired of singing to these large, not congregations necessarily, but just, in big venues, because everybody was just coming to hear the music. They weren't coming really for that intimate connection with Jesus. And so the reason why some of those groups came in to where we were was because they liked the fact that it was smaller and that they could have a more intimate contact with those who came. And it was just, they found it easier to make sure the focus stayed on Jesus. So just a lot of interesting dynamics that have occurred over the last 50 years that has led us to this place. And what is amazing to me is as we look at the book of Galatians, we see that same struggle, that struggle that began. Now, it was over different issues. It wasn't over music. It wasn't, over some counterculture stuff like the Vietnam War protests and things like that, and the Make Love Not War. It wasn't necessarily specifically, it wasn't like that, but it was similar. And I'm going to show you what I mean as you turn to chapter 4 of Galatians, and we've worked our way to that point. And before I get into chapter 4, I want to give you a new kind of central passage here that I want you to see, because it basically tells us what the rest of the book of Galatians is about. So it says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free." So we're to have freedom. With freedom comes responsibility and obligation. And this is where we struggle. This is why it goes awry. This is why we are a little more comfortable with more structure, more rules, more this, more that. But the truth is, we ought to be free to dance. We ought to be free to run, just like the song says, because it's for freedom that Christ has set us free. That's why He set us free, so we could experience freedom. And one of the things that Paul is saying to the Judaizers and to some of the Christians who are trying to add things to the Christian faith and who ultimately are following either people or following a systematic belief system of some kind, he's saying to them, the whole idea of Christ setting us free is so that you can be free. Why are you enslaving yourself again in all this other stuff, like the systematic belief system of the Jewish religion, or following the rabbis and the leaders, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and all these folks? People were all zoomed in on them, and they were fine with that because that way they could control the people. So Christ comes in, He creates an atmosphere of freedom, and people kind of step into that, and then it's a little bit scary, so they tend to kind of step back. So the Judaizers come in, they say, well, no problem. You can still be Christians, but you have to be circumcised. You have to eat certain foods and not eat other foods, and you need to go to some festivals and things like that. And so here we are, that same struggle between where should the focus be? Where should the focus be? So look what it says. It says, it is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by the yoke of slavery. So we actually put ourselves in the situation of being slaves to either personalities or to systems of belief or to certain traditions or rituals that we've kind of grown up with. And without realizing it, we say we're free in Christ, but we're still bound up in so many things that really come out of culture and don't necessarily come out of the Bible. So let's go on further. I think is there a little more? Is that it? Okay. So if you skip over then to verse 13 of chapter 5, let me look at that real quick. You, my brothers, were called to be free. Now, this is important. Now, do not use your freedom to indulge in the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. So, the whole Jesus' love movement that started in music back in the early 70s, it's still trying to break through the barriers that we throw up. The walls of the church, personalities, belief systems, and so forth. Rather serve one another in love. Now here's where Jesus makes that incredible statement about the most important commandments. The entire law is summed up in a single command. He's saying, look, forget about the systematic stuff. Not that it isn't important, but you're basically putting all your marbles in that basket. And that's why we're about to lose our marbles. What we need to do is put our marbles in this basket. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Now, if you do that, then the focus has to be on Christ. One of the things we talk about in football is when we tackle someone, we put our face mask right on the ball. So you have the ball carrier, and he's got the ball right here, right, Malik? So when you do that, that's how you tackle. Now, a couple can happen. One is you can knock the ball out of the runner's hand and so forth. But here's the interesting thing. When you put your face mask, I know some of you are going, I don't really like football anyway, but when you put your face mask on the football, you actually cannot be out of position, the right position to tackle someone, because you're going to be like you're supposed to. You're going to be, you're going to be able to get your arms around them, because when your face mask is right there, it puts the rest of your body where it's supposed to be. So when we put our focus on Jesus being love, and we love our neighbor as ourselves, when we put ourselves in that position, it puts everything else in the right place. When we take our eyes off Him, when we don't make Him our focus, then our technique is all wrong. We're going to miss that tackle. We're going to get run over. We're going to get hurt. You apply that however you want, but that's what's happened in many cases over the years in the church. All right, so go back to 4 and look at what Paul's talking about in 4. And maybe one other thing I want to read to you before I do that. This is important. Since the Galatian converts were born to be free, they ought to live to stay free. To do so will require the determination to avoid a lapse into legalism on one hand, or libertarianism on the other. So you can go so far as to, well, I'm free, I can do anything I want, or you can be so legalistic that, your God is like, looks down and goes, whatever you're doing, stop it. He's no fun at all. So the middle ground has always been Jesus. Has always been Jesus. So when we get our focus on Him, then things begin to work. It says the former defaults it and the latter debases it. So Paul continues with his concern for the Galatians. And here's where the comparison is, and it's not easy to see. Most of the time we just sort of read the verses and try to interpret those, and that's good. That's what we're doing right now. But one of the things you need to see is the backstory. What's going on here is even Paul himself is struggling. How do I get these folks to focus on Jesus? And he's trying to get them to get their focus off of what they had their focus on before and put it on Jesus. But in doing so, he's actually struggling with keeping them from getting their focus on Him. And you know of several statements that he makes. He says, imitate me. But he's not talking about imitating himself. He's talking about imitate me because I'm trying to be like Christ. So imitate Christ. That's what he's really saying. And even in this passage, he says, become like me. But then there's a struggle of, wait a minute, they're seeing me as some kind of angel from God. I don't want them to see me that way. I'm the chief of all sinners. So even then, there was issues of, well, I'm going to get focused on Paul. And even in the New Testament, there's a couple of instances where someone was for Apollo and someone was for someone else. And it's so easy for us just to get stuck in that rut of following someone or something. And Paul had this same struggle. So he says, formerly, when you did not know God, you were slaves to those who by nature are not gods. Who is he talking about? He's talking about the Jewish leaders. They weren't gods. They were just people, but you were slaves to them because you did what they said. They controlled you. But now you know God, and then he stops and says, wait a minute. Or rather are known by God. Now that's important. You see, to know God is a good thing, a good statement, right? But when we're reaching up to God, it's really religion. When God reaches down for us, which is what He did, He took the initiative. He loved us first. He gave His Son for us, even while we were yet sinners. So then it becomes a relationship. And this is what Paul is helping himself and the Galatians to get straight. So, but now you know God, or rather are known by God. How is it that you are turning back to those weak and miserable principles? The reason why they're so weak and the reason why they're so miserable is because ultimately they don't work. One of the things that I concluded early in ministry, and I have to be honest, I don't know that it helped me at all. Probably didn't. But there was something that I just sensed wasn't right. It's like it sounded good, it looked good, but it didn't work. I think God's a pretty practical God. Bible's a pretty practical book. Yet what we were doing didn't seem to be working. And so something was wrong, but I don't know that I could have put my finger on it at that point. Do you wish to be enslaved by them all over again? So you get your freedom in Christ, and now you're going to give up that freedom and go back over here and get underneath the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The problem was, though, when they were coming over here, then they were getting under Paul. So Paul was saying, whoa, no. When I say imitate me or become like me, I mean become like Jesus. That's where your focus needs to be. But see, even Paul, it wasn't necessarily Paul's fault, but even people struggled with that back then. Well, I'll follow Paul, or I'll follow Apollo. I don't know, I can't remember the other person's name that they followed, but that had to be broken up. So the people in the Bible were struggling with the same things that we are, just little different circumstances. You are observing special days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that somehow I have wasted my efforts on you. So Paul's getting pretty frustrated. I plead with you, brothers, become like me, for I became like you. So basically what Paul says, remember he talks about another place where I become all things to all people that I might win some. So he goes to the Gentiles, the Galatians, and he has given up his Jewish practices. And he says, look, hey, I'm all about Jesus. So you need to be all about Jesus. And so he's going, wait a minute, who are you focused on here? Are you focused on the Judaizers or the Pharisees? Are you focused on me? We're talking about the freedom that Christ has set us free for. This is about Jesus. This isn't about me. It's not about religion. It's about the one who came and saved you, who died on a cross for you. Now, he talks about the fact that you've done me no wrong. He says, as you know, it was because of an illness that I first preached the gospel to you. Even though my illness was a trial to you, you did not treat me with contempt or scorn. Instead, and here was the problem, look what it says, you welcomed me as if I were an angel of God, as if I were Jesus Christ himself. Now, that was both a compliment and a confusing situation for Paul. Wait a minute, I'm no angel. I'm certainly not Jesus Christ. Wait. I'm pointing you toward Christ, not me. But what we've discovered in the 20th century and even into the 21st is that if we can get somebody into a particular personality, we can get a lot more people. If we can get the music right, we can get a lot more people. If we can get a program right, we can get a lot more people. And it's true. It's absolutely true. But there is an underlying flaw that nobody wants to hear. And certainly not going to want to hear it from me. I'm nobody. I just soon stay that way. But I'm telling you, what we've missed is the focus on Christ. We've done it in every kind of church. Every kind of church. I've had a couple discussions, as I think I shared last Sunday night, about how the church tends to take on the personality of the pastor. There are some pastors who still like that model. They want that model to happen because they probably will get more people. If they have a good personality, they'll get more people. But in many cases, they don't necessarily have that charismatic or charisma that many personalities have. And so they struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle and struggle. That's why 80% of our churches are, where they are today. And Paul was dealing with something similar here with the Galatian church. What has happened to all your joy? Great question. And then when Paul says to them, don't focus on me, focus on Jesus Christ, then he says, have I now become your enemy by telling you the truth? The people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. So he's dealing right now with the whole personality issue. Those people, those Judaizers, what they want is to alienate you from us. So they're trying to pull you away from us so you may be zealous for them. Can you see the battle going on between these personalities? And even Paul is struggling with the idea, I'm not trying to win you to me. I'm trying to win you to Jesus. Nothing wrong with being zealous if the purpose is good and so forth. Now, in the next part of chapter 4, he talks about Hagar and Sarah. And he says some things that are pretty straightforward, to say the least. I want to see if I can find where he makes a comparison between Isaac and Ishmael. And what he says is, if you go with the Judaizers, I'm just going to summarize it, and you can read the little story for yourself there in chapter 4. If you go with the Judaizers, if you go back to where you're actually not children of Abraham or Isaac, you're children of Ishmael. You're into the legalism thing. And you're not really part of the Christian community, because the Christian community is defined that way. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Stand firm. Don't be burdened again by all that other stuff. And there's a diagram in here, but I can't find it at the moment. Maybe I'll find it by next week. But it's very interesting how it shows the delineation of, we start with the handmaiden that was had the illegitimate child of Ishmael, and then Sarah, who had the extraordinary birth. The other one was an ordinary birth. Sarah's was an extraordinary birth. And so Paul is saying, if you go with the Judaizers, you're really on the Ishmael side. You're not on the Isaac side. Now, you talk about an insult. that to the Jewish community. Because they're trying to come in to these Gentiles and get them to become basically Jewish along with them in terms of following the rules and the laws. And so that's why in chapter 5, after he gets done talking about the difference between Isaac and Ishmael and Abraham, he starts with verse 1, chapter 5. It's for freedom that Christ has set you free. And then he has to go, and as I mentioned earlier, and talk about, hey, I'm not talking about freedom with no responsibility or freedom with no obligation. And that's why he says, love your neighbor as yourself. If you love your neighbor as yourself, are you going to do anything wrong to your neighbor? No, you're not. If you love God and love your neighbor as yourself, would that not cover everything? How can you break anything that has been written in the past? See, it's actually a fulfillment. Doesn't eliminate it, it's just a fulfillment of. But it's a fulfillment that's focused on Jesus. And I am telling you, people are looking for a different focus. They may not know it, but they are. I can tell the way that they shop for churches. I can tell for the way that they look for certain things that they think they want and think the way things ought to be. Jesus, as I stated last week, is not enough. We've got to have something more. Paul says Jesus has to be enough. You can't even add me to it, Paul says. I think Paul probably was stumbling a little bit over his words when he said things like, become like me, imitate me. I think he was just desperate to get people to follow Jesus like he was. But instead, they focused in on him. In some cases, he became an enemy to them. In some cases, he became sort of that charismatic personality. So even in Scripture, we see this struggle that is still going on today. I don't know how to solve it. I just have a few ideas. Just from a practical standpoint, I think it would help immensely if churches had more than one pastor. At least two, maybe multiple pastors, where it's hard for anybody to get focused on just one personality. Now, I understand we all have our favorite preachers, and we like this preacher a little better than that one, and so forth. I mean, I have my favorite songs, you have your favorite. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a church that is set up in a way where only the focus can be on Jesus. Can't be on one human person. You have to take that away, that temptation away. And it's still a struggle, because it's human nature to do that. And that's what we're struggling with right now, here in this church, and we're struggling with it out there in many other churches. And frankly, I understand why the churches who have these huge congregations with one pastor, I understand why it works. It's easier. You find that 2%er who's got that charisma and great preaching every week. And yeah, I get it. It's easier in some ways. Much easier than doing what we're trying to do. And after literally decades of this model, breaking that model is hard. Because we're not sure how that's going to work. What kind of worship culture are we going to end up with? Well, I hope we end up with one that's focused on Jesus. Whether we're more quiet or we're more loud or we're whatever it is, I hope it's a combination. It's a blend. You know, there used to be, and I'll end with this, there used to be churches approached music like radio stations did. If radio stations played all kinds of different music, like country music, rock music, punk rock, rap, all of them, typically what happened was they didn't get any audience. And even today, if you listen to some of the radio stations, except for there's a few that have, and doing well, they all are focused on either country music or rock music or hard rock or this or Christian music or whatever. Except there are a few stations that are actually blending. They're using a little bit of, in some cases it's the hits of yesteryear and mixed with the hits of today and so forth. The blending concept is becoming more acceptable. It's also happening in churches. We sang at least 3 songs today from the Baptist hymnal, and I think there was 3 others that we sang that were not. That's actually called blending. Now, I only say that to give an example of how it can be done. But there's some that don't want it to happen. Especially some pastors. They want everything to be focused on them. And they may not even realize it. It may be unintentional. They may love God and do great things. But the fact is, when they leave, half the people leave. And you know this because it's happened here. So somehow or another, we got to get the focus back on Jesus. This is what Paul was struggling with in Galatians all the way through. He finally kind of gets to the end of trying to say, stop devouring each other and stop allowing this to devour the church and live by the Spirit. Now there's the key right there, living by the Spirit. And that starts in verse 16, and that's what we'll start with next week. And we're going to talk about how living by the Spirit allows us, do you know one of the things about maturity is when you can believe with conviction what you believe and not be contentious with those who don't. Believe it or not, that's a sign of maturity. I got lots of people that I talk to about my beliefs. There's a few of them that don't hold the same beliefs I have. And I've discovered that if I want to be contentious about it, all I do is drive them away, alienate them. Instead, if I just talk and dialogue and I'm comfortable in my skin, I have a much greater chance of leading them and winning them to Christ. I have to be okay sometimes with the way other people believe, that it's not exactly what I believe. And even within the Christian faith, as long as the focus is Jesus, I'm not that concerned about the non-essential stuff. Now, I don't know, maybe I'm a heretic, I don't know. But to me, I don't care. What I care about is, where is your focus? It's got to be on Jesus. And when it is, all that non-essential stuff takes care of themselves as well. You get that helmet, that face mask in the right position, everything else takes care of itself. Our goal as a church, as merging together with another church, as difficult as it appears to be, our goal is still to focus on Christ and to let something grow out of that focus. And I think it will be more of a blend of cultures. And I think that's how we let Jesus impact our culture. We let that happen instead of resisting it or running from it, which happens a lot of the time. Now, I don't know how much good my sermons do in that regard. I wonder sometimes, Pastor Gary, how much good sermons do at all. But it's not really about my sermons. It's really about a Savior. And that's how we need to get our groove back in the church. We've got to get back to Jesus. Then things will be as they should. It's my prayer anyway.